Summer 2022, and King Charles III leads the remembrances for the life of his mother, Queen Elizabeth II. The death of Queen Elizabeth marked a major watershed. She had reigned since 1952 following the death of her father, and for many, she was the only monarch they had known in their lifetime. The outpouring of sadness and of admiration for her years of service was both remarkable and unprecedented. The start of King Charles's reign could hardly have been more grueling or emotional. It represented the end of a journey that had begun some 75 years before with the marriage of his parents.
it was indeed announced that in November they would marry, amid, great public pleasure.
Said that what they did was they united two slightly different concepts of monarchy, that the Queen had inherited what he described as a semi-divine idea of monarchy, and Prince Philip embodied a sort of hail fellow, well met idea of monarchy, and that the two were incredibly powerful as a cocktail.
November the 20th, 1947, and London's background of misty grey became the setting of the greatest royal event the capital has seen since the coronation. Tremendous crowds assembled near the palace, thrilled again to a half-forgotten but once familiar spectacle, the troops of the household cavalry in all the glory of full dress.
After that, for a brief and probably, to them, wonderful period, Princess Elizabeth was able to live maybe the closest to a normal life she ever had. Because Prince Philip was stationed to Malta. His wife went out on long visits to be there with him, where she was indeed able to live the life of a Navy wife, driving herself around the island, going to restaurants, going to the beach. But all too soon that came to an end. Sooner than anyone might have expected, perhaps, because her father's health had never been strong, lifelong smoker, of course, and damaged by the stress of his accession and the war. And it became apparent that Princess Elizabeth was going to have to take on more of his duties. And it was a little bit like a house of cards, like dominoes falling. The king's health, Princess Elizabeth having to take on more duties, which meant that Prince Philip's naval career would soon become unsustainable. He had to, abandon what looked like a very promising career indeed, come back to Britain. And soon, yes, if Princess Elizabeth and Prince Philip went abroad, as they did, to Canada, say, there was packed in the luggage paperwork that would be needed in case in the course of that trip she turned from princess to queen.
Prince Charles Philip Arthur George was born on November the 14th, 1948. His grandfather, George VI, was monarch, and Britain was just recovering from the darkness of the Second World War, with rationing still in force and a battered country struggling to recover. Only 4 years later, and Charles was heir to the throne.
Queen, the great ceremony over, having withdrawn into the chapel of St. Edward the Confessor, returns to pass in procession through the choir.
There's a very interesting piece of sort of royal history. When Prince Andrew was born, he was the first to be called Mountbatten Windsor. Philip took on the name of Mountbatten when he was naturalised after the war, before he married the Queen. And Mountbatten saw this as an opportunity to create the Mountbatten line. The Queen was torn because she wanted her husband to be able to give his name to their children. But there was, in a sense, establishment pushback. They'd only just created the House of Windsor after the First World War. And they didn't want to confuse things by having another name. And so the compromise was with Andrew, and indeed with subsequent children, that they're now known as Mountbatten Windsor.
The Queen and her family arrive at a sports ground in Chelsea for Prince Charles's school field day. And Charles does the honours by introducing his friends, first of course to his mother, and then to his father. The boy at the end of the line the Duke has met before. The programme is an hour's display of PT and sports by 100 boys, starting with a handball game whose rules seem to be a cross between netball and rugby. Prince Charles is not a very skillful sportsman as yet, but he's certainly sporting, and he usually manages to be in the thick of whatever is going on. Right now it's cricket. There don't seem to be any sides, and everybody changes places much too quickly to get bored. Charles at the wicket, and on the ball. Not only parents are watching, the railings are well lined too, as Charles takes over the bat. Here he comes. And there it went. But he doesn't miss all the time by any means. A lot of the strokes wouldn't be found in wisdom, but it's results that count, and he knocks up a couple of useful falls. Father may have something to say about that finger down the splice when he gets home. Princess Anne particularly enjoys the relay race, in which her brother's team builds up an early lead. Of course, royal encouragement from the sidelines helps a lot, and Charles makes a sound contribution to the team's effort. Result, a win for Charles's team.
Prince Charles has always made it clear that he did not consider his upbringing to be emotionally satisfactory, that the mothering he got came more from his grandmother, as he would seem to think. Now, it's only fair to the Queen to say that Princess Anne seemed to have rather different memories. But Charles was obviously an uneasy and anxious boy, and his position and his parents perhaps didn't altogether aid that. The Queen deliberately left a good deal of the parenting to Prince Philip. It was partly a decision that, if she had to be head of the country, then it was a sop to Prince Philip to be at least head of the family. But the decisions that he made, like sending Charles to Gordonston, were not, where he himself had been very happy, were not ones that Charles later approved.
Gordonstown is the royal choice, the school in northeastern Scotland to which the Duke of Edinburgh went himself. This is where Prince Charles will be in the next summer term and be treated the same as all the other 400 boys. Indoors and out, Gordonstown stresses initiative, character, self-reliance, and of course fitness. Those who discover that they have special talent get the chance to develop it. When Prince Philip was there, he took part in amateur dramatics, apparently amused about it, and captained the cricket 11. Eton was expected by most people outside the royal circle to be the school of the future king. This is preeminently the choice of the establishment, the key into the cabinet, perhaps the foremost school in the world. But probably, had the Prince of Wales gone there, it would have widened the gap between the royal family and the people. To Cheam, the Eton of prep schools, Prince Charles went in November 1957. As the Duke was there too as a small boy, the son is following the educational pattern of the father. His arrival made it a memorable day for the prince and the school, though the boys took it in their stride. That day was just over 4 years ago. Prince Charles is said to have enjoyed every minute of his time there and has grown into early adolescence as fine a boy as his parents could have wished. He is now 13 and no doubt looking forward to moving to a senior school. Gordonstown is only a cycle ride from the sea. Naturally, seamanship instruction is very popular.
But it's a real question whether he was given the kind of training of upbringing that a 21st century monarch would need. I guess looking back, you know, the 50s, the 60s, no one could have guessed what that would be. But in a sense, perhaps it's to Prince Charles's credit that he's managed to make himself more in tune with a lot of the current concerns, the environment's the striking example, than his upbringing would have led one to believe. If you look at pictures of Prince Charles in his youth, I mean, the 60s, the 70s, what everybody else was wearing and what Prince Charles was wearing, it's scary. The 60s and 70s were very difficult decades for the royal family because it was very hard for them to remain even remotely in touch with what the rest of the youth of the day were doing. I mean, at a time of sex and drugs and rock and roll, how could Prince Charles be in touch with the rest of his generation without utterly losing step with the royal family? Perhaps it's quite important, perhaps it was formative, that Charles did find himself so, in a sense, in a bit of a limbo between two different worlds.
Cambridge. Trinity College waited to welcome a new freshman, and it's not every newcomer who's greeted by the master, Lord Butler. But then the new boy was the heir apparent to the throne, arriving in a Mini for a major step in his career. The occasion was both informal and formal, with Lord Butler introducing Prince Charles to Mr. Dennis Marion, the senior tutor. It was clear from the start that the college's motto, always the same, won't really apply for the next couple of years while the prince studies archaeology and anthropology there. There was even a ceremony of the key, not quite Tower of London style, but a sign of independence for the royal teenager. Then, with Lord Butler, a stroll across the main square, a walk that will become familiar to the prince in the months to come.
As a small child, Prince Charles, much like Princess Anne, had really quite a lot of public exposure. They didn't have a very secluded or protected childhood in some ways. Prince Charles then does manage to retreat a little bit, the second half of his schooling and also while he's at university. But as soon as he embarks on an independent royal role, public engagements of his own, obviously he becomes a figure of interest. And unsurprisingly, he is branded the most eligible bachelor on earth. And along with that comes a kind of fevered speculation about who is going to become the wife of this incredibly eligible bachelor. And until he gets married, that story can run and run and run. And I think that must have been an awful strain for him, an awful strain for anybody on whom he set his sights, and probably a strain for his family, because the news always likes novelty. Obviously, that's what news means. And it does seem to be true that the period of least interest to the public in anyone's lives is middle age. So once the Queen and Prince Philip were middle-aged, as they themselves acknowledged, they were much less interesting to the public, and public interest transferred to their two elder children, Prince Charles and Princess Anne, and of course, obviously Prince Charles as the next king. And I think that must have made it extraordinarily difficult for him to pursue any sort of romantic life that had any connection with most people's understanding of those words.
Prince Charles, like the rest of the royal family, has a slightly schizophrenic relationship with the media. On the one hand, they want it, know they need it. Prince Charles, as a young man, was on TV a lot and in some unexpected places, like Jackanory, for example. And of course, at that time, he was probably trying to forge a role for himself, while effectively he was in waiting for, his eventual accession. But on the other hand, of course, they both hate and fear it, because they know the media has the power to do hideous damage to their lives, and they resent the power it has over them and what it wants.
Those mighty Welsh voices bore the message of the people who were to welcome Prince Charles as their own. This young man was ready to take up his royal office to serve the proud race who opened their hearts to both him and his mother, the Queen, on this historic July the 1st. The young prince, with a dignity and assurance belying his years, followed the centuries-old pattern of ceremony and went to the Chamberlain Tower to await the Queen's command. A modern prince in a medieval castle kneeling before the Queen, who was fulfilling a promise and giving Wales a worthy prince for its own, in a manner set down centuries ago.
But this was a fleeting moment, and the only event in decades that gave him centre stage. As the years went by, it was his love life that consumed the press interest, rather than his role as Prince of Wales. In addition to his mother and father, Charles also had a formidable royal advisor.
Mountbatten, I think, has an important role for lots of members of the royal family. I mean, he was the person the Queen looked to when she first came to the throne. She was a young woman in her early 20s. Here was a man who'd been Viceroy of India and Supreme Allied Commander in Southeast Asia, who had been close to her father, who was a man of the world and had a strong sense of what royals should do in the future of the monarchy. And so he played a role, and I think a lessening role throughout her reign, but she always listened to him, didn't always take his advice. But I think for Charles, that was this grandson he'd never had. He had two daughters. And by 1965, when Charles was really being groomed for his future role, Mountbatten had time, having retired from public life, more time than Philip. And so, for example, no member of the family was due to go to Charles's passing out at Dartmouth, and Mountbatten went. But he gave Charles a room at Broadlands, particularly when he was based at Portsmouth. He was allowed to entertain girlfriends there without any scrutiny from the press. There's an extraordinary amount of correspondence between them, this elder statesman and the young prince who wants to learn about statecraft. So very, very close, and we get a sense of that when Mountbatten is killed in 1979 to see how devastated Charles is. So a very, very important position, which carries on to the present day. I mean, several younger members of the royal family are called Louis after Louis Mountbatten. Well, the interests of Mountbatten and the interests of the monarchy were often conflated. So if he could do both, that suited him best. And he, for example, tried to put Charles and one of his granddaughters together, again trying to cement this relationship. And one sees it also, I mean, the relationship between the two families over several generations has remained very close. But I think Mountbatten had a wide range of contacts. He had known Churchill since he himself was a boy. He was a world statesman, so a lot of these he could, and he was a great name dropper, and so he was clearly a figure of great influence on younger members of the royal family, and he had a sense. He was very pragmatic. He was very similar to his nephew Philip. Wide interests both in the arts and in technology, in the importance of education, in this very strong sense of public duty. And I think all these things were passed on to Charles, much more from Mountbatten than in fact from Philip.
Prince Charles never gave much sign of enjoying his youth, his early youth. He famously complained how awful it was to be Prince of Wales. Not the first Prince of Wales to have said so, of course. You know, one of his predecessors said, "It's not a position, it's a predicament." But later on, perhaps he got to enjoy some of the perks of it. You know, but by his bachelor days, he did at least look as though by then he was having some fun.
Meanwhile, in East Sussex, a young woman was growing up unaware of the role she would play in royal life.
Camilla Shan had a wonderful childhood. She had parents who adored each other and who were quite modern in that they had very few demands on her about behaviour. They allowed her to run free, she could ride horses, she didn't have to even come home at night, she could sleep out. And that's in the time when there were no mobiles. They just trust her to have a lovely time. The thing that her mother expected of her, regardless of whether she liked it or not, was to join her and her husband for dinners with adults. Camilla said it was very boring, but her mother said it was very important that she learned how to talk naturally to people and never left a gap. Now that's fascinating, because who would imagine that it would be so useful in her role now? As in fact of their wealth, they were very comfortable. Her mother's family had absolutely pots of money, and they owned a large part of London. But of course, the one everybody knows is Alex Keppel, and she was Camilla's great-grandmother on her mother's side, and she became the favourite mistress of Queen Victoria's son. Camilla had no royal connections. She would what you would call sort of halfway up the ladder of aristocracy, but she was carefree and fun and had loads of friends and very, very sociable, but not with any royal member of the royal family. Her parents weren't interested in her education. They just wanted her to enjoy life. And she went to a school that had no interest in getting their pupils to university. This suited her fine, because her mother at the time, quite old-fashioned, felt that her role was to get married, to be able to lay flowers very nicely on the table, and to look after the home in a very sophisticated way. So she got out with, I think, one O-level, which wasn't very good. What she did instead was to go to finishing schools, which were very popular then, and learn how to judge wine, how to get out of a car, all those terribly important things perhaps now, but at the time was just fun. She went to two finishing schools, really. The first one was in Switzerland, which was quite well known, and she met lots of friends there. They would smoke and drink and giggle about boys. And then she decided to take herself to Paris, where she wanted to learn to speak better French and to understand a bit of French literature. She's always loved books. Her father and she had a lot in common, and he was very, very encouraging that she read a lot. He read to her and her sister and younger brother a lot, and he felt it was very important. And Camilla has stayed with that all her life, and now as a senior member of the royal family, she is very, very keen on literacy and talks to young people, old people, poor people, about the benefit of literacy and how it helps not just in the way that you read, but in the way that you deal with life and understand things. She and her father also very much enjoyed horse racing, and she went on races with him when she was only 7, but he insisted that she wore absolutely immaculate clothes then, where she went around, and she did actually until it got very serious with Prince Charles, wear a baggy jumper and jeans. And she was a debutante, and she went to lots of balls and dances, and the hope was that she would meet somebody who was suitable within her sort of slight aristocratic circle. And so it was just all about having fun and reading books. And she had one job, which was to be a receptionist, and she got the sack within a week because she came in very late because she went to a party the night before, And the director there was actually furious and didn't want any apologies, and so that was that. She was very good at socialising. She had loads of boyfriends and lots of girlfriends. People liked her. She's very funny. She's got an extremely quick sense of humour. It's very self-deprecating. She's always saying how dreadful she is, but in a funny way, and you know it's not true. And very welcoming, very caring about people, not a snob. And yes, people did flock around her, liked her a great deal. She started going out with Andrew Parker Bowles, who was a womanizer extreme, and from the age of 17. And but it was on and off, because he would go off with other women and then come back and forth. But she obviously did love him at some point, but he was what I think you could call flaky. And so she didn't meet Charles until she was 24 and he was 22. They first met because her friend, Lucia Santa Cruz, took a flat above hers in Westminster. And they became very friends because they were neighbours, and she was the daughter of the Chilean ambassador to the UK. So she had very good contacts, and she did get to know Prince Charles. There's been lots of rumours that she was one of Prince Charles's girlfriends, but that's not true. She told me that they were just very good friends. And she was going to go out with Prince Charles one evening, and she thought it would be very nice to introduce him to Camilla. And they called her up for a drink, and that's how she first met him. Now, the interesting thing is that she said to me that she had no idea that why she did that. You know, it was a spontaneous feeling. And they obviously built a relationship, lots in common, countryside, horses, laughing, joking. They got on very well. But of course, it was impossible to take it seriously, because she had, as they say, a history. And at that time, in the 1970s, it would be impossible to think that the heir to the throne would have not just a commoner, but also one who wasn't a virgin.
I think when the Prince of Wales meets Camilla Shand, there is still a very strong idea in royal circles of what a royal spouse ought to be like. There's a degree of nervousness and caution. And obviously, as we know, those factors contributed to that relationship not being fulfilled at that particular point.
Mountbatten said to Charles, who loved and admired his great uncle, that she was not suitable material to marry. And he arranged it that Charles would go into the Navy and go off to the Caribbean and be gone for 6, 7, 8 months, and that way split it up. And so they parted. And Camilla, who wasn't going to hang around and obviously still had some feelings for Parker Bowles, decided to, well, he obviously asked her to marry him, and they did marry. Charles was heartbroken about it.
Well, you've got to wind the clock back to the early 70s. First of all, he went off into the Navy, so he was away a lot. Secondly, she was actually in love with Andrew Parker Bowles, who was a cavalry officer, very good looking, knew when to strike. You know, you think of the Prince of Wales as a young, insecure, sort of nervous, almost, dare I say, sort of dithering figure, compared to this sort of, terribly good-looking, sort of, I don't know, it's almost Barbara Cartland hero, Parker Bowles type, so she married him, and then that was a big blow to Prince Charles. He was away at sea at the time when he heard that she was going to marry Parker Bowles, and he sort of, is very miserable about the whole thing.
I think Prince Charles really found himself caught in a kind of limbo between two different worlds. in several different ways. As a boy, as a young, very young man, there he was looking like his grandfather, in suits and ties and a short haircut and brogues, at a time when the rest of the world was, rest of the young world was going into heaven knows what, psychedelic, a rainbow. But perhaps that gap between two different worlds impacted him more seriously, because perhaps it framed his marriage to Princess Diana. In a sense, that marriage was the last gasp of the old regime, because the old world, that had seen royal marriages as a matter of public arrangement in which everyone did their duty, and great love was not perhaps to be expected. Those are the ideas which Prince Charles brought to it, perhaps. Diana Spencer, of course, brought the ideas of a very different, a younger world. In a way, the gap between them was more than the actual age gap. So in a way, Prince Charles did fall into the gap, and the gap between two worlds, the old and the new, and of course, Princess Diana fell with him.
In my position, you're going to marry somebody who perhaps one day is going to become queen, and you've got to choose somebody very carefully, I think, who could fulfill this particular role, because people like you perhaps would expect quite a lot from somebody like that.
That interview before the marriage, where Prince Charles was asked whether he was in love, and Princess Diana said, of course, and he said, whatever love means. Now, we now know that Prince Charles was absolutely capable of love, the love he feels for Camilla. But he didn't expect that to frame his dynastic marriage. And that's the views of an old world of monarchy.
I understand that Prince Charles actually asked you for your daughter's hand.
Yes, he did. Very nicely.
And I'm amazed that she's been brave enough to take me on.
He said, rather surprisingly, she agreed to marry me, he said.
At what point did you decide that this was the right lady for you? I mean,
well, gradually.
Do you find it a very daunting experience that yesterday you were a nanny looking after children, now you're about to marry the Prince of Wales, and one day you would, in all likelihood, be queen? It's a tremendous change for someone, if I may say, of 19 to make all of a sudden, the transition.
It is, but I've had a small run up to it all in the last 6 months. And next to Prince Charles and I can't go wrong. He's there with me.
I'm sure Diana will be a wonderful wife to Prince Charles and a wonderful mother to his children.
And I suppose in love.
Of course.
Whatever in love means.
July 1981, and so to the most romantic picture book wedding of the century. The nation held its breath and wiped away a tear as they saw the beautiful day unfold.
When she had to get out of the carriage and all these miles and miles of billowing English silk, she didn't think she was actually going to be able to get out and climb out of the carriage. And it was so sweet, and she was giggling about it. And then when her father took her arm, she told me he'd had a stroke, and she just didn't know if he was going to make it. She was more concerned about her father being able to make it down the aisle than anything.
For better, for worse.
For better, for worse.
For richer, for poorer.
For richer, for poorer.
In sickness and in health.
In sickness and in health.
To love and to cherish.
To love and to cherish.
Till death us do part.
Till death us do part.
I, Diana Francis.
I, Diana Francis.
Take thee, Charles Philip Arthur George.
Take thee, Philip Charles Arthur George.
To my wedded husband.
To my wedded husband.
And of course, it was sealed with a kiss. But 15 years later, following a flurry of media frenzy, rumours and lurid headlines, the inevitable took place. Charles and Diana divorced. Camilla put her head down and tried to keep the lowest of profiles.
HRH the Prince of Wales versus HRH the Princess of Wales appearing last. The document issued this morning sets out that it was the Prince who lodged the petition for divorce on the grounds that the marriage had irretrievably broken down because of irreconcilable differences. It was signed by both the Prince and Princess.
But worse was to come. Fate dealt the most terrible blow. On the darkest of nights, Princess Diana, mother to the young princes, died in an awful car crash.
Well, actually, going back before the accident, if you think about it, when they started doing those documentaries, which they certainly shouldn't have done, and particularly the panorama interview that the Princess of Wales did, at that point, again, I thought the Queen was rather adept, because she stepped in and said, this has now got to end, and you two must get divorced. Because I remember at the time that neither of them were really willing to, as it were, institute proceedings against the other. And she lifted that responsibility from them.
When Diana died in the car crash in Paris, her first concern was for the children. She didn't sort of say, poor me or poor Charles, or, the first concern was how terrible for the children. So she was never a monster. People said she was the most hated woman in the country, and her life was in danger in some ways because people were so repulsive about her. But she handled it very quietly. She didn't complain, she didn't explain, which is one of the Queen's comments about things, and she somehow lived through it. She avoided the press by trying to behave and actually being pleasant to them. When they crowded round with the children, were still at home, she would say, we know who it is, don't be rude. And she just wouldn't talk to them. But it was very difficult for her to get out because she would be surrounded by paparazzi, and there was no protection officers to look after her because she didn't belong to the royal family. And she got her friends to shop for her in the supermarkets. She's got loads of friends, and they did that. So she was really in lockdown.
By now, Camilla and Andrew Parker Bowles were living separate lives. Then, in 2002, things changed again.
Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, died in 2002, 801, and that freed the Queen to do more of what she wanted. She adored her mother, obeyed her, and obviously the Queen Mother was furious that her plan had fallen apart and broken, and she didn't want to even hear the name of Camilla. So Elizabeth, behaving very well towards her mother, wouldn't have anything to do with it either. So once her mother had died, she could go to an event where Camilla was. On the other side, Camilla started doing charitable work, first of all with osteoporosis, which her mother died from. And it's very interesting because the more she began to get involved, the more work she wanted to do. And she suddenly felt that she could really help others. And she was very dutiful. She began to work harder and harder for the royal family. She never complained. She was always the epitome of good manners and respect. And she was very, very good at dealing with all the charities that she got involved with. And the Queen warmed towards her because she was doing just what she wanted people to do within the royal family. Prince Philip and the Queen realised that Charles was not going to change his mind. He'd never really stood up to them. He'd done what he thought would please them, but actually he was determined not to let Camilla go. And once they'd really got used to that and so knew that he wouldn't change, they then wanted him to get married quickly because they come from the old school where you don't live with somebody, you marry them. And so that then led to Charles asking Camilla to marry him.
And on April the 8th, 2005, what had previously been seen as almost unthinkable occurred: the wedding of Charles and Camilla.
The wedding, which happened very quickly after the engagement, because what on earth were they waiting for? Prince Charles was 56, Camilla older. And it was a very, very moving moment. It makes me cry too. And she was just radiant.
If I had been their press officer at the time and was wanting to spin this marriage, I would have said, you know, he has done the duty of the Prince of Wales, which is to secure the Protestant succession. That's how it was at the time. He's produced 2 boys. He now seeks companionship in his approaching old age. There's no more children going to be born of that union. Why should he not have the companionship which a great number of fellow citizens in this country and across the Commonwealth find themselves? And she was never a threat in that sense. But the Queen, I think, has been very clever. First of all, you know, giving her the Garter at the beginning of the year, and then she announcing that she wishes her to be known as Queen, which she always would have been by law anyway. If Prince Charles had come to the throne and that had not been resolved, and he had said, actually, I want her to be Queen, I think there would have been a hoo-ha, and the people have said, oh, you said to us, you know, she's going to be Princess Consort and all that. So I think it was a very shrewd and generous move of the Queen to secure that, and she did it the time of the actual 70th anniversary of her accession. And if she asks us, the British public, one small favour, I think we jolly well grant it with the best will and the biggest smile on our faces possible, frankly.
And in legalising their relationship, Charles and Camilla took a huge step, cementing Camilla's place and position in the royal family. Her own growing popularity and charm ensured that the events of May 2023 were all the more well received by the people of the United Kingdom.
She becomes more popular by the day, particularly with people who've actually met her. She's one of these people. She's very straightforward. She's got a tremendous sense of humour. And when she's talking to you, she's looking at you. She's looking into your eyes, not over your shoulder, who might be more important and more interesting, but to you. She gives quality time.
God save the King!
God save the King!
Receive this ring, a symbol of royal dignity and a sign of the covenant sworn this day. May thy servant Camilla, who wears this crown, be filled by thine abundant grace and with all princely virtues. Reign in her heart, O King of love, that being certain of thy protection, she may be crowned with thy gracious favor, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Receive the royal scepter. Receive the rod of equity and mercy. May the Spirit guide you in wisdom and grace, that by your service and ministry, justice and mercy may be seen in all the earth.
Majesty.